You? Too poor to buy the silver on this table, boy. So don't you dare, don't you ever dream about my daughter again.
You too poor to buy the silver on this table, boy. So don't you dare, don't you ever dream about my daughter again. Eleanor Peaton tilted her glass, slow savoring it, and let the wine bleed across the marble at Silas's feet. Then she laughed. Bright, delighted, cruel. Her guests laughed with her. She had him march to the gate like a thief, looked her own daughter dead in the eye, and called him nothing, and slammed the door so hard the chandeliers shivered. 3 years later, he came back and bought her entire empire. Every brick, every dollar, her too. Charleston in late spring smelled of salt and jasmine, the way it always had, and Silas found that the smell was the only thing about the city that had not lied to him. He came back on a Tuesday, riding into the historic district in the passenger seat of a contractor's pickup, wearing a canvas work jacket and a pair of boots that had been deliberately scuffed to look older than they were. Nobody on the street gave him a second glance. That was the point. A man could move through the world unseen if the world had already decided what he was, and 3 years ago the world here had decided that Silas was nothing. The Marlowe Hotel sat at the end of Bay Street, a 4-story shell of faded grandeur wrapped in scaffolding. It had been built before the Civil War, ruined by neglect, and bought by the Peaton family 2 generations back when the Peatons still believed they could buy permanence. Now it was the last property in their portfolio that still turned a profit, the one jewel the family could not afford to lose. Silas knew this better than anyone alive, because he had spent 3 years quietly learning exactly how much the Peatons could not afford to lose. He had not come to admire the architecture. He had come because the restoration of the Marlowe was the soft seam in the whole estate, the one place where a man could get close enough to feel the stitching come apart. The foreman who hired him barely read the application. Silas had made sure the paperwork said all the right small things, and none of the large ones, a trade certificate, a few years of carpentry references that led to phone numbers answered by people he employed. By noon, he had a hard hat and a clipboard and a place on the crew restoring the grand staircase. By 1 o'clock, he had seen her. Hadley Peaton stood on the second-floor landing with a roll of drawings under one arm, talking to an electrician, and for a moment the years folded shut and she was exactly the girl he remembered. Then she turned, and she was not. She was sharper now, more careful, the kind of careful that comes from learning that softness gets punished. She wore her authority like a coat that did not quite fit, and Silas understood, watching her, that her mother had given her the title of project manager, the way a person gives a child a toy steering wheel, something to hold while the adults drove. She saw him a beat later. The drawings nearly slipped from her arm. He watched her face do the arithmetic, the work jacket, the boots, the hard hat dangling from his hand. He watched her try to fit the brilliant young man she had loved into the body of a laborer on her family staircase, and fail and feel something break a little behind her eyes. "Silas," she said. "Miss Peaton." He said it evenly, the way a crew member says a client's name, and he saw the formality land like a slap she had not braced for. She came down the stairs too fast. Up close, she smelled the same, and he hated that he noticed. "What are you—" She stopped herself, glanced at the electrician, lowered her voice. "What are you doing here?" "Working," he said. "Same as you." "You're not the same as me." "No," he agreed, and let her decide what he meant by it. She studied his hands. He let her. 3 years of a particular kind of life had put calluses across his palms, real ones, because Silas did not believe in a disguise a person could not pass a handshake. Whatever she had imagined for him in the years since her mother threw him out, it had not been this. He could see her grieving a version of him that had never existed, and he told himself the ache it caused him was tactical, a thing to be noted and set aside. "I heard you left the state," she said. "I did. And you came back to hang doors." "Somebody has to." Her jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she would say the thing they were both standing on top of her mother, the wine on the marble, the sentence that had ended them, but a man in a suit appeared at the top of the stairs and called her name, and the moment closed like water. "Hadley," the man said. "We're waiting on you." That was Wade. Wade Peeton was Hadley's cousin on her mother's side, a man whose chief talent was standing near money and looking like he belonged to it. He had been given the financial oversight of the Marlowe restoration because Eleanor trusted blood over competence, and Silas had read enough of the project's paperwork in the last week to know that Eleanor's trust was in this case a very expensive mistake. "Coming," Hadley said. She looked back at Silas once, and there was a question in it she did not have the standing to ask. Then she went up the stairs to her cousin, and Silas went back to the staircase, and the day went on as if nothing in it had changed. That night, a black sedan picked him up 2 blocks from the boarding house, where he was pretending to live. The driver said nothing. In the back seat, Silas took out a phone that was not the cheap one he carried on the job, and made a single call. "How close are we on the last tranche?" he said. The voice on the other end belonged to his attorney, a precise woman named Diane Holloway, who had been with him since the beginning. She had been there since the logistics software he'd built in a borrowed apartment turned into a licensing deal, and there when the deal turned into the thing that made the real money, the patent that every freight company on the eastern seaboard ended up paying to use, the one that turned a broke 22-year-old into a man whose net worth doubled, and doubled again faster than anyone watching could explain. She had been there when the money became the kind of money that frightened people. She told him the numbers now. He listened. He told her to keep the fund's name off everything the way he always did, and she told him she always did the way she always did. There was a small item in the financial news that week buried under louder things. An unnamed private fund had been quietly acquiring distressed real estate debt across the Low Country, and no reporter had managed to learn who was behind it. Hadley would not have read it. Almost no one did. But it was there the way a single thread is there in a seam waiting for the right hand to pull it. Silas had not planned to pull anything for her. That was the truth he kept returning to in the days that followed turning it over. The way a man turns a coin he is not sure is real. He had come to let the Peetons rot from the inside, to stand in his work boots and watch the family that had humiliated him collapse under the weight of its own arrogance, and to be the one holding the deed when it did. He did not need to lift a finger. He only needed to wait and to make sure that when the fall came, there was nothing under them to catch it. Then he found Wade's numbers. It happened by accident, which was the only part Silas allowed himself to call honest. He had been pulling permit records to check a load-bearing question on the 3rd floor, and the permits did not match the invoices, and the invoices did not match the payments. And once he started following the gap, it opened into a canyon. Wade had been skimming the restoration budget for the better part of a year, padding contracts with vendors that existed mostly on paper, approving change orders for work that was never done, moving money in small enough increments that no single transaction would draw an eye. It was not clever. It was simply quiet, and quiet had been enough because the only person above Wade was Eleanor. And Eleanor did not read ledgers. She read people, and she had decided long ago that her nephew was loyal, which to Eleanor was the same as safe. For Silas, it was a gift. He understood that the moment he saw it. Wade's theft was a fault line running straight under the Marlowe, and the Marlowe was the last solid ground the Peetons had. He did not have to bring the family down. He could simply do nothing, let Wade keep digging, and be there with the fund when the floor gave way. It was cleaner than anything he could have engineered himself. It was in every sense the revenge he had come for, handed to him by the very arrogance he had come to punish. The problem was Hadley, because it would not be Eleanor who answered for the missing money. Eleanor would find a way to land on someone else's back the way she always had. It would be Hadley, the project manager, the name on the paperwork, the one who had signed the documents she had been told to sign without being shown what was underneath them. When the Marlowe fell, it would fall on the only Peeton who had done nothing to deserve it. And Silas discovered, standing in a half-gutted ballroom with a folder of stolen numbers in his hands, that he could not make himself feel good about that. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself for 3 days. On the 4th, he wrote the analysis. He did it the way he did everything now, carefully and well. He laid out the discrepancies in a single clean document, the padded contracts and the phantom vendors and the change orders that led nowhere, with the dates and the dollar figures arranged so that the pattern could not be argued with. Anyone who read it would understand within 2 pages exactly what Wade had done and roughly how much he had taken. It was the kind of work that should have taken a forensic accountant a month. And Silas did it in an evening because numbers had always come to him like a first language, and because some part of him wanted it to be unmistakable. He left it on Hadley's desk in the site trailer unsigned after the crew had gone home. He did not disguise his handwriting on the single line he wrote across the top, "Start with the vendor list." He told himself this was carelessness. It was not. He had spent 3 years learning to leave no trace of himself anywhere, and a man who could hide a fortune from an entire city did not forget to hide a sentence by accident. He wanted her to know it was him. He did not examine why. She found it the next morning. He was on the 2nd floor when he saw her come into the trailer through the window, saw her pick up the pages, saw her go still. He could not hear her, but he did not need to. He watched her read the line at the top twice, and then he watched her look up and out the trailer window, scanning the site, looking for him, and he stepped back from the glass before her eyes could land. She did not come find him. That was the first thing that told him she had changed. The old Hadley would have come straight to him, all heat and hurt, and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. This one did something better. For the next 3 days, she said nothing to anyone. She came in early and left late. Silas watched her pull her own copies of the vendor contracts, watched her sit with the invoices, watched her cross-reference payment records against a site she did not know he could read upside down through a trailer window. She was not taking his word for it. She was building the case herself, brick by brick, so that when she finally moved, she would be standing on her own evidence and not on his. He had given her a thread. She was weaving a rope. On the 4th day, she called a meeting. Silas was not invited. He was a carpenter, but the trailer walls were thin and the windows were open to the spring air, and he positioned himself near enough to hear Hadley tell Wade and 2 of the project's senior staff that she was suspending the current vendor contracts, voiding the existing bid, and reopening the entire procurement process for the remainder of the restoration. Wade's voice climbed. "You don't have the authority to do that." "I'm the project manager," Hadley said. "The contracts go through me. They came in through me and they go out through me." Her voice did not rise to meet his. It stayed level, and that was worse for him because it meant she was certain. "Every vendor reapplies. Every invoice gets reviewed. If the work is clean, there's nothing to worry about. Your mother approved these contracts. Then my mother will want to know why so many of them were paid for work that was never done." The trailer went quiet. Silas, standing in the sawdust outside with a level in his hand, understood that she had just done something that could not be undone. She had not gone to Eleanor first. She had not protected the family's face. She had chosen the principle over the name in a household where the name was the only god anyone worshipped, and in doing so, she had stepped directly into her mother's path. He should have felt the satisfaction of a plan advancing. The crack he had come to widen was widening now, and Hadley's own hand was the one widening it. Instead, he felt something more dangerous, something he had not budgeted for in 3 years of careful arithmetic. He felt the thread between them, the one he had told himself he had cut, pull, taut again across the distance and hold. She came out of the trailer a few minutes later, the folder of his analysis in her hand, and she walked across the site straight toward him, no longer caring who saw. The thing in her eyes was not the question from the staircase anymore. It was an answer that had not finished forming. "I know it's you," she said quietly, stopping in front of him. "I just don't know what you are." Silas looked at her, at the woman who had just set fire to her own inheritance with a match he had handed her. and for the first time since he had come back to Charleston, the cold plan he had carried for 3 years did not feel like the only thing he owned. "Neither do I," he said. "Not anymore." Eleanor Peaton heard about the voided contracts before noon, and by evening she had decided that the problem was not the contracts at all. The problem was the carpenter. She had not built what was left of the family's fortune by misreading a room, and she did not misread this one. Wade's bluster meant nothing to her. Her nephew had always been a small man with small hands and shallow pockets, and if he had been stealing, that was a thing to be managed quietly, the way one manages a leak before guests arrive. What unsettled her was her daughter. Hadley had moved against the family's own arrangements without coming to her first. And Hadley did not have that kind of spine on her own. Someone had given it to her. Someone had put a folder in her hand and a straight line in her back, and Eleanor intended to find out who. She had Wade pull the employment records for the entire Marlowe crew. She made calls of her own to the kind of people who answered her calls because their grandparents had answered her grandparents. And what came back about the carpenter named Silas was on its surface nothing at all. A trade certificate, a clean work history, references that checked out when checked. No debts, no record, no story. A man with no story was in Eleanor's experience the most expensive kind of man there was, because it meant someone had paid to erase him. She found the loose thread the same week Hadley reopened the bids, though she pulled it in the wrong direction. One of her contacts, a man who moved money for people who did not want their money seen, mentioned in passing that a private fund had been buying up distressed low-country debt for years, and that the carpenter's name had surfaced once glancingly on the edge of that fund's paperwork. Eleanor sat with that for a long evening. She arrived at the conclusion that any reasonable person in her position would arrive at that Silas was a hired instrument. A scout, a fixer, a low man sent in by some larger predator to soften the Marlowe up from the inside before the fund moved to take it. The idea that the carpenter himself was the predator did not occur to her because the architecture of her entire life forbade it. Men like Silas did not own funds. Men like Silas were sent. The conclusion frightened her more than the truth would have, and it made her reckless. She drove down to the Marlowe herself the next morning, which she never did, and she found reasons. The grand staircase balusters were the wrong profile. The crew was behind schedule. A man had been seen loitering near the site trailer after hours. She wanted him gone, not fired, which would require cause she did not have but pressed harried, made so miserable on the job that he would leave on his own. For 2 weeks, she manufactured friction. She had Wade reject Silas's work and order it redone. She had the foreman moved off the crew and replaced with one who took instructions from the family. She tightened the screws the only way she knew how, by making a man's days small and humiliating, and she waited for him to break the way he had broken once before at her dinner table, with the wine running across the floor. He did not break. He redid the work without complaint better the second time than the first, and every morning he was there before the others, and every evening he was the last to leave. His steadiness unnerved her more than defiance would have. She had built a life on knowing what a man would do when she pressed him, and this one did the one thing she had not accounted for. He simply held. What Eleanor did not let anyone see, what she had not let anyone see in 40 years, was why she pressed at all. She had been 26 when the family nearly went under the first time. Her father had still been alive, then still nominally in charge, and into that household had come a man named Calvin Reese, who had nothing and a beautiful way of talking about everything. Eleanor had believed him. So had her father. Calvin had been given access, then trust, then signatures. And by the time the family understood that he had been quietly bleeding the estate into accounts they could not reach, he was gone. And 3 generations of Peaton money had gone thin enough to see daylight through. Eleanor had spent the next 2 decades sewing the hole shut by hand. She had learned a single lesson from it, and learned it down to the bone that a person with nothing and a beautiful way of talking was the most dangerous thing that could walk through your door, and that the only safe man was a man who already had what you had, because he did not need to take it. It was not a lesson about color. She told herself that fiercely and often. It was a lesson about hunger. But somewhere across the years, the two had fused in her hunger, and the men she had learned to fear until she could no longer feel the seam between them, and she mistook her fear for judgment and her judgment for love. So when she had looked at Silas 3 years ago, brilliant, penniless, looking at her daughter, the way Calvin had once looked at the family ledgers, she had seen a thief who had not yet stolen anything, and she had thrown the wine on the floor to drive him out before he could. She had not felt cruel. She had felt like a woman pulling her child back from a ledge. That she had been wrong was a possibility she had never once allowed herself to hold, because to hold it was to admit that the lesson she had organized her whole life around might have cost her the one thing she had been trying to protect. She did not allow it now either. She doubled down the way frightened people do. When pressing the carpenter failed, Eleanor changed the board entirely. If she could not remove the man from her daughter's orbit, she would remove her daughter's freedom to choose him. She announced without consulting Hadley that the family would be entering into an arrangement. That was the word she used, arrangement, as if it were a delivery schedule with the Callaways, an old Charleston family with deep money, and a son named Preston, who was pleasant and dull and entirely safe. A marriage between Hadley and Preston Callaway would shore up the Peton balance sheet, restore the family's standing, and end whatever it was that had gotten into her daughter. Eleanor presented it at dinner as a decision already made, the way she presented everything, and she watched Hadley's face go white and then very still. "You don't get to do that," Hadley said. "I've already done it," Eleanor said. "The Callaways are delighted. You'll find Preston is easy to be fond of if you let yourself." "I'm not a contract." "Everyone is a contract, darling. The only question is whether you negotiate your own terms or let someone negotiate worse ones for you." Eleanor set down her fork. "I have watched this family come within a breath of nothing once, and I will not watch it again because you've decided to play at principles with a man who hangs doors." Hadley left the table. She left the house. She drove through Charleston in the dark with no plan and no destination, and she found that her hands had taken her to the only place in the city that had ever felt like the opposite of her mother's table. Silas opened the door of the small rented house near the harbor before she knocked. He had heard the car. He stood in the doorway in a plain shirt, no work jacket now, and for a moment the two of them only looked at each other across the threshold, 3 years of everything unsaid stacked between them. "She's marrying me off," Hadley said. Her voice did not shake, and the steadiness of it was its own kind of breaking. "To Preston Callaway. She decided. She just decided." "Come inside," Silas said. She did. The house was sparse, almost monastic, nothing in it that spoke of who he really was, and she did not notice because she was past noticing anything but the thing she had driven across the city to say. "3 years ago, I let her win," Hadley said, standing in the middle of his small front room. "I stood there and I let her throw you out, and I told myself there was nothing I could do. I was 21. I had no money of my own. The whole world was hers, and none of it was mine. And I have hated myself for it every single day since. I am not doing it again. I don't care what it costs. I'm not letting her decide who I am one more time." Silas looked at her, and the careful distance he had kept since the staircase, the formality, the level voice, all of it came apart in his hands. "I never blamed you for that night," he said. "You were a kid trapped in her house. I blamed her. I have blamed her every day for 3 years. He stopped because the next thing was true, and he had not meant to say it. "I came back to make her pay for it." "I know," Hadley said. "I've known since I read your handwriting. It doesn't frighten you. What frightens me is that you'd come all this way to burn her down and not tell me you were here." She crossed the small distance between them. "You were going to do all of it without me. I didn't come back for you." He said it plainly because she deserved plainness and because he needed to know if it would send her out the door. "I came back for her," You were the part I didn't plan for." Whatever he had braced for, it was not the way she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, the way a person checks that something is real. "Then plan for me now," she said. What came after was not the explosion of two strangers. It was the quiet, devastating recognition of two people who had spent 3 years learning to live without something and discovering all at once that they had never actually managed it. The hurt did not vanish. It simply stopped being a wall. They stood in the small room and held on to each other as if the floor of the whole city had tilted, and for a long while neither of them said anything that needed saying with words. Later in the dark, Silas almost told her. The truth sat at the very front of his mouth: the fund, the debt, the 3 years of quiet acquisition, the 47% he had built like a wall around her family without her knowing. He almost said all of it. And then he felt the shape of how it would sound, that he had engineered everything, that even her hand on his face could be folded into the long machine of his revenge. He understood lying there, that the truth had changed its nature without his noticing. For 3 years, his identity had been a weapon, the blade he was keeping sheathed until the moment of maximum damage. Now, holding her, it had become something else entirely. It had become a thing that could hurt her, and a weapon you cannot use without wounding the person you are trying to protect is no longer a weapon. It is only a secret, and secrets Silas was learning are heavier than blades. He said nothing. He told himself there would be a better time. There is almost never a better time, but men in love have always believed in it anyway. The annual Peton Gala arrived 2 weeks later in the restored ballroom of a rival hotel, because the Marlowe was still wrapped in scaffolding, and Eleanor used it to do the thing she did best, which was to make the family's strength visible to a room full of people who measured strength by how visible it was. Hadley came because not coming would have been a declaration she was not ready to make in public. Silas came because Hadley asked him to, and because he had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that he was only a carpenter. Eleanor found him near the edge of the room, away from the music, exactly as she had found him 3 years before. She had a check folded in her hand. She had written it herself that afternoon, a number large enough to change an ordinary man's life, small enough to mean nothing to her, and she presented it to him with the same certainty she had presented the marriage, the same certainty she had brought to the wine on the floor. "I'll be direct since you seem to value directness," Eleanor said. "I don't know who sent you, and at this point I find I don't care. This is more than they're paying you. Take it, finish whatever job you came to do somewhere far from my daughter, and we never speak again." She held out the check. "Men like you always have a number. I'm asking you yours. 3 years ago, a sentence like that had broken something in him and sent him out a door. He had replayed it 10,000 times since, and in every replay he had said something cutting, something that wounded her the way she had wounded him. He did none of that now. He looked at the check, and then he looked at Eleanor. Really looked at her, at the fear she had dressed up as contempt at the woman holding a piece of paper, as if money were a fence that could keep the world the shape she needed it to be. And he smiled. It was not a warm smile, and it was not a cruel one. It was the smile of a man who knows the price of a thing the other person believes is priceless. "There's no number, Mrs. Peton," he said. "There was never going to be a number." He did not take the check. He did not raise his voice. "You should keep that. You're going to want every dollar you have very soon." He walked away from her then into the light and the music, and left her standing at the edge of her own party, with her hand still out, and the first true cold of fear moving up her arms. She did not understand what he had meant, but for the first time in 40 years, Eleanor Peton stood in a room she had paid for and felt the floor of it shift under her and could not tell which way it would fall. She went home and made calls. She did not sleep. And while she did not sleep, she did the one thing left to a frightened person with power: she moved first. By morning, she had spent every favor and every fear she had cultivated over 4 decades, and she had assembled quietly enough votes on the Peton family board to do what she should have done weeks before. She would strip Hadley of her operating authority at the board meeting that very morning, void her daughter's standing in the company entirely, and sell the family's controlling interest in the distressed properties to the first buyer at the first price before whatever predator was circling could close its jaws. She would burn the house down herself rather than let someone else take it. It was, she believed, the only move that could save them. Silas got the call before dawn. Diane Holloway's voice was flat and fast. Eleanor had the votes. The meeting was at 9. By 10 o'clock, Hadley would be out. The controlling interest would be sold to an outside party, and 3 years of patient, invisible work would be worth exactly nothing, because the one asset Silas had never managed to acquire was time, and Eleanor had just taken the last of it. There was only one way to stop it. He had spent 3 years making sure no one in Charleston knew his name. To save Hadley, he would have to walk into that boardroom in the daylight and tell all of them exactly who he was, and accept that Hadley, watching him reveal a fortune he had hidden from her through every honest moment they had shared, might never again believe that any of it had been real. He sat in the dark with the phone in his hand, and understood that the secret had finally come due, and that there was no version of paying it that did not cost him something he could not afford to lose. "Tell the board I'm coming," he said. The Peaton family board met in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building Eleanor's grandfather had put his name on, and at 9 o'clock that morning, Eleanor took the chair at the head of the long table, as if the day already belonged to her. It nearly did. She had the room, and she knew it. The faces around the table were the faces of men and women whose families had been entangled with hers for generations, people who owed her or feared her, or simply preferred the version of the future in which she remained the one to be owed and feared. Wade sat to her right, pale and useful. Hadley sat halfway down the table alone with a single folder in front of her, and no allies that anyone could see. Eleanor did not waste the morning on ceremony. She called the meeting to order, and then she read in a voice as even as a court clerk's a resolution removing Hadley Peaton from all operating authority within the family company, effective immediately on the grounds of mismanagement of the Marlowe restoration and the unilateral voiding of approved vendor contracts. She had dressed the knife in the language of governance. It was cleaner that way. When she finished, she set the page down and looked at her daughter with something that was almost gentleness, the look of a woman who believes she is doing a cruel thing for a kind reason. "This isn't punishment, Hadley," Eleanor said. "It's protection. One day you'll understand the difference." 3 years ago, Hadley would have crumbled or wept or run. 2 months ago, she might have. But she had spent those 2 months building something her mother had never taught her to build, which was a case that stood on its own legs, and she did not crumble now. She opened the folder in front of her. "Before the board votes," Hadley said, "they should know what they're voting on. The matter isn't open for—" "The matter is mismanagement," Hadley said, and her voice carried down the table without rising the same level steadiness Silas had heard through the trailer window weeks before. "So let's talk about the management. These are the Marlowe vendor contracts for the last 14 months. These are the invoices paid against them. And these are the permits and inspection records for the work those invoices claim to cover." She slid copies down the table, and the board members took them the way people take a thing they are not sure they want to hold. "I'd like someone to explain to me how we paid $140,000 to a millwork vendor that has no address, no employees, and no record of ever having milled anything. I voided those contracts because they were fraudulent. If that's the mismanagement I'm being removed for, then I'd like the minutes to reflect exactly what I was managing." The room changed temperature. Wade had gone the color of paper. 2 of the older board members were already turning pages, frowning, and Eleanor felt the certainty of the morning begin to slip half an inch out from under her, because her daughter had just done the one thing she had not predicted. She had refused to fall quietly, and she had brought receipts. "These are serious allegations," one of the board members said slowly, a silver-haired man named Halloran, who had known Eleanor for 30 years. Eleanor, did you know about this? My daughter is deflecting, Eleanor said. Wade's contracts can be reviewed in due course. The question on the table is... The question on the table, Halloran said, just changed. It had not become a victory. Hadley knew that even as she watched it land. She did not have the votes. She had only made the votes uncomfortable, turned a coronation into a question, bought herself a few minutes of doubt in a room that had walked in decided. But she had done it herself with her own hands on her own evidence, and whatever happened next, no one in that room could ever again say that Hadley Peeton had simply been carried. That was when the door opened. Silas walked in, and for a moment no one in the room understood what they were looking at, because the man who came through the door did not match any version of him that belonged in this building. He was not in a work jacket. He wore a suit that had been cut for him by someone who cut suits for very few people, dark and quiet and unmistakable, the kind of clothing that does not announce money because it has never once had to. He crossed the room with the ease of a man who had been in 1,000 rooms exactly like it, and the ease was the thing that frightened them before they understood anything else. Eleanor recovered first because contempt was the fastest thing she owned. "This is a closed meeting," she said. "I don't know how you got past the floor, but the carpenter can wait downstairs with the rest of the—" "Mrs. Peeton." The voice that interrupted her did not belong to Silas. It belonged to the woman who had come in behind him, a precise figure in a charcoal suit carrying a leather folio, and she set the folio on the table with a small final sound like a door closing. "My name is Diane Holloway. I'm counsel to the controlling shareholder of the entities that hold the Peeton family's outstanding debt. My client asked me to be present this morning. I'd recommend the board hear what I have to say before it votes on anything." She opened the folio. She did not hurry. She laid out the documents the way Silas had taught her to lay out everything so that the pattern could not be argued with the acquisition records, the assignment of notes, the long, quiet history of a single private fund buying up the Peeton family's distressed debt across 3 years, one position at a time, never loudly, never traceable, until the debt was no longer owed to a dozen scattered creditors, but to one. And then she laid out the last document, the one that made Halloran sit back in his chair and made Wade put his face in his hands, the one that established beyond any argument that the fund had converted enough of that debt and acquired enough on the open market through instruments no one had thought to trace to hold a position in the Peeton enterprise that no other shareholder in the room came close to matching. As of the close of business yesterday, Diane said, "My client holds 47.3% of the voting interest in this company. That is the single largest position at this table. It is larger than the family block Mrs. Peeton assembled overnight, which I'd note tops out at 31%. Any resolution this board passes this morning passes or fails at my client's discretion." The silence in the room was total. Eleanor's eyes moved from the lawyer to the man in the dark suit standing quietly beside her, and the arithmetic she had spent 40 years trusting failed her all at once because there was only one conclusion left, and it was the one her entire life had told her was impossible. "Who?" Eleanor said, and her voice was not even any more. "Who is your client?" "You've met him," Diane said. 3 years ago, at your dinner table." Silas stepped forward then, and he did not smile the way he had smiled at the gala. There was nothing to win here that smiling could win. "You looked into me," he said to Eleanor. "You found a fund buying low-country debt and a carpenter standing near it, and you decided I was the errand boy. You couldn't make the other answer fit because the other answer meant a man you threw out of your house with wine on the floor had walked back in, owning the floor." He let her hold it. "There was no one who sent me Mrs. Peeton. I'm the one they were all afraid of. I built it myself every dollar, starting the week after you told me I was too poor to dream about your daughter." He turned to the table to the board, and his voice shifted into the register of a man conducting business because that was what this was now. "I'm calling the vote my counsel referenced," Silas said. "Two matters. First, the resolution removing Hadley Peeton from operating authority is withdrawn, and I'd ask that the minutes reflect why, because the conduct it cited was hers, correctly identifying fraud that this board's chair declined to investigate. Second, he looked at Eleanor, and for one moment, 3 years and a wine-stained floor passed between them with nothing said. I'm exercising my voting interest to remove Eleanor Peeton as chair of this board effective now. It was not violent. It did not need to be. It was 4 sentences in a quiet room, and it ended an empire's worth of certainty, because that is how real power works, not loudly, but completely. Halloran called the vote because someone had to, and the room that had walked in belonging to Eleanor voted position by position, the only way the numbers allowed it to vote. When it was done, Eleanor Peeton sat at the head of a table that was no longer hers, and the thing that had organized her entire life, the absolute conviction that she alone stood between her family and ruin, sat in pieces in front of her, and the man who had broken it was the man she had been most certain could never touch her. She did not weep. Whatever else Eleanor was, she did not weep in rooms. But something in her face came apart very quietly, the way old plaster comes apart, and for the first time anyone present could remember she had nothing to say. It should have been the moment Silas had wanted for 3 years. He had imagined it in 100 sleepless forms. Eleanor brought low the floor taken out from under her, the look on her face when she understood. He had built his whole exile around the shape of it. And now that it was here sitting in front of him, he found that it tasted of almost nothing at all, because the only face in the room he actually cared about was not Eleanor's. It was Hadley's, and Hadley was looking at him as if she had never seen him before. He understood it instantly, because he had spent 2 weeks dreading exactly this. She was running the arithmetic he had run for her in the dark of his rented house, the fun, the years, the silence. The small monastic house that had told her nothing because it had been designed to tell her nothing. The man who had said, "Come inside and plan for me now," while holding a 47% secret behind his back. He watched her understand that everything she had walked across the city to give him, he had received while withholding the largest truth he owned, and he watched the joy of being saved curdle in real time into the suspicion that she had been all along simply another moving part in a machine built to ruin her mother. The board was filing out. Wade had already gone. Diane gathered her folio and made herself absent in the way good lawyers can. And in the emptying room, Hadley stood up and faced him across the long table. "How long?" she said. 3 years. All of it. Since the week after the dinner. The house by the harbor, there's nothing in it. You did that on purpose." "Yes. That night I came to you." Her voice was steady, which was worse than if it had not been. "I told you I was done being decided for. I put my hand on your face, and you already had all of this." She gestured at the table, the folio, the wreckage of her mother at the head of it. "You let me think I was choosing a carpenter. You let me feel brave. And the whole time I was just walking into the last act of something you'd already written." There it was, the exact wound he had known the truth would open, laid out in her own words. He could have softened it. He had the kind of money that buys very good softening. Instead, he did the thing he had learned too late, and at too high a cost, was the only thing worth doing with her. He told the truth. "I came back to destroy her," Silas said. "That's real. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the revenge wasn't real because you'd know I was lying and I'm done lying to you. I came back for her, and you were the thing I never accounted for, and I told you that in the dark, and it was the truest thing I'd said in 3 years. He came around the table slowly so she could step back if she wanted to. She did not. "I didn't tell you about the fund because by the time I wanted to, it had stopped being a weapon and started being a thing that could hurt you. And I was a coward about it. I kept waiting for a better moment, and there wasn't one, and this is what waiting cost me. You're right to be angry. I'd be angry." "Then why didn't you let her win this morning?" Hadley said. "If it was about her, you had your revenge the second you walked through that door. You didn't need to save my job to ruin my mother." "No," he agreed. I didn't. And then he did the thing that no one in 3 years had seen coming, least of all himself, when he had first imagined this room. He turned to where Diane had left a single document on the table, the one she had set aside for exactly this, and he slid it down to Hadley. "That's a transfer of voting proxy," he said. "It assigns the full voting power of my 47.3% to you. Not the ownership. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I'm giving you the money I'll keep because I earned it, and because owning the debt is the only thing keeping this company out of worse hands than mine. But the votes, the control, every decision this enterprise makes, it makes through you now, not me." He held her eyes. "I spent 3 years building the one thing big enough to take your mother's power away from her. I'm not going to turn around and hold it over you the way she held it over you your whole life. That's the difference. That's the only way I know how to show you the difference." Hadley looked at the document for a long moment. The proof was not in anything he had said, because anyone can say anything. It was in the page in front of her, a man handing away freely the exact instrument of control he had spent 3 years and an entire hidden life to acquire. You do not give away your only weapon to someone you are still playing. She had managed enough of her mother's world to know what power cost, and she was looking at a man setting his down on the table between them with his hand open. "You should have told me," she said finally. "I know. In the house. That night. You should have told me then and trusted me to still choose you." "I know," Silas said. "I didn't trust it. After 3 years of holding it, I didn't believe a single true sentence could survive in the same room as all of that. That was my failure, not yours." He looked at the proxy between them. "I'm telling you everything now. It's late. But it's everything." Across the room at the head of the table she no longer owned, Eleanor had not moved. She had heard all of it, and the thing that broke in her now was not her power, which was already gone, but the thing underneath the power, the lesson she had organized her entire life around, that a man with nothing and a beautiful way of talking would always in the end take everything. Because she had just watched a man with everything, a man she had given every reason to take it all, set it down instead, and hand it to her daughter. Calvin Reese had walked into her father's house with empty hands and walked out with the family's fortune. Silas had walked into hers with the family's fortune in his pocket and was in front of her walking out having given it away. For 40 years, she had been certain she was protecting Hadley from men like him. She had spent that whole time mistaking the one man who would not take for the kind of man who would, and the cost of the mistake was sitting in the silence of the room. "I was wrong about you," Eleanor said. The words came out of her like something pulled up by the root. They were not gracious. She did not know how to be gracious. She had never had to learn. But they were true, and everyone in the room knew what they had cost her. "I have been wrong about you since the night I threw you out of my house." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You were." He did not gloat. There was nothing left to gloat over. "But you raised her. And whatever else you got wrong, you didn't get her wrong. She fought you. She built the case that saved this company before I ever walked through that door. You taught her to be strong enough to stand against you, and that turned out to be the best thing you ever did, even though you didn't mean it as a gift." Hadley signed the proxy. Then she set the pen down and looked at her mother, and something passed between the two women that was not forgiveness, not yet, but was perhaps the first cleared ground where forgiveness could one day be built. 6 months later, the Marlowe opened. The scaffolding came down on a morning in autumn, and the old hotel stood in the clean Charleston light, looking the way its builders must have dreamed it would look and never quite managed to keep it. Hadley ran the company, now ran it well, ran it through her own decisions and her own signature, and the board that had once walked into a room ready to remove her now waited to hear what she thought. She had not been carried there. She had built it brick by brick, the same way she had built the case in the folder, and everyone who mattered knew it. Eleanor kept a small office in the building, Hadley had insisted on it over Silas's mild objection and her mother's stiff, disbelieving silence, a quiet role, no power to speak of a place at the edge of a thing that had once been entirely hers. Eleanor took it because the alternative was nothing, and slowly, in the way of someone learning a language late in life, she began to look at the man her daughter loved and see at last only the man, and not the color of him or the empty pockets he had once had, or the fear she had dressed up for 40 years and called wisdom. In the hotel's restored garden on the evening of the opening, Silas and Hadley stood together a little apart from the lights and the guests. The jasmine was blooming again the way it had the day he came back, and the city smelled the way it always had, except that now it was not lying to him. "You gave me the votes," Hadley said. "You could have run all of it. Most men would have." "I didn't build it to run it," Silas said. "I built it to put it down in front of you." He took her hand, and there was nothing of the old distance left in it. No formality, no carpenter, no secret. "I spent 3 years thinking I came back to take something from your mother. Turns out I came back to give something to you. I just had to lose almost everything to figure out which one it was." They stood in the garden where 3 years before a woman had decided that a poor young man was not allowed to dream, and the dream had outlived the decision, and there was no longer anything in the world standing between them. Equals. Free. The beginning of something neither of them would have to ask anyone's permission to keep. And that's where Silas and Hadley's story comes to rest in a garden on equal ground, with nothing left between them but the future they finally get to choose for themselves. But I'd love to hear what you thought. Did Silas do the right thing by handing Hadley the votes instead of keeping the power for himself? Or was there a part of you that wanted him to make Eleanor pay a little more before he let her keep that small office? There's no wrong answer. Stories like this live or die on how they make us feel. And I'm curious where this one landed for you. And here's the thing I really want to ask. So many of us have known an Eleanor, someone who looked at a person we loved or at us and decided we weren't enough. Someone who measured worth in money or in the wrong things entirely and got it completely wrong. If you've ever lived through a moment like that, or watched someone you care about prove a person like that wrong, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Your stories are where the best of these scripts actually come from, and the ones you tell often end up becoming the next story I get to write. So if something in this one reminded you of your own, tell me about it. I read them all, and I'm always grateful you're here.